Should Australia have a national carbon price? Well, that's the question we're going to be investigating in today's episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. So let's get right into it. A national carbon price has been catapulted onto the front of the agenda in Australia since the federal election in May of 2025. What has brought this about, though, in the recent past has been a couple of learned economists, such as Ross Garnaut and also Ken Henry, speaking out about the potential benefits to Australia of having a national carbon price. Sitting behind that are a couple of key tasks for the government in this term, the first of which is to finalise a 2035 climate target to present to the 30th Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change later on this year in November, being held in the city of Belém in Brazil. And the second really important component is that Australia's Renewable Energy Target program is coming to an end in 2030. And as a result, and with the projects already being sufficient to meet most of the demand for renewable energy certificates in that timeframe, we're now seeing a strong reduction in the price of LGC certificates, or the large scale renewable energy certificates. So there's a number of factors which are driving this discussion forward. Plus, later on in August, there is going to be a roundtable meeting convened by the Australian Treasury to look specifically at the issue of economic reform and also of productivity. So all of these things combined set the foundation for a broader discussion that is about to occur at the national level on whether or not it's time to re-examine the case for a national carbon price. The next question of relevance is, what would a national carbon price actually look like for Australia? Well, essentially, there are two choices. The first choice is to have an emissions trading system, which is based on a cap and trade methodology. And the second option is to have a carbon tax. An emissions trading system puts a cap on emissions for a whole range of sectors and possibly also the entire economy of Australia, and then allows the market to determine the price by finding the lowest cost alternatives to reduce emissions. So, in effect, an emissions trading system provides certainty over the environmental outcome and allows the market to determine the price. Whereas a carbon tax is a system whereby the government or a centralized authority determines a carbon price that is going to apply, and it is then variable as to what the actual volume of emissions is that is delivered by that carbon tax. Now, of course, the carbon tax can be altered over time if it's looking like there is not enough abatement occurring. But in principle, the idea is that the price is certain, but the volume of abatement is not. Now, either a cap and trade emissions trading system or a carbon tax could in fact also be linked to other markets abroad, and that can either be through direct linking with other emissions trading systems, like, for example, South Korea, New Zealand, the European Union. There are also emissions trading systems developing in places like China. So there are ways to link the Australian market to others directly. And there are also indirect linking options whereby Australia could recognise international credits that can be imported into Australia and used as a compliance instrument. And it's also possible for Australia to allow some degree of exporting of credits produced in Australia to be used by entities abroad. And the final component is that an Australian national carbon price may also include something along the lines of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, whereby if Australian energy intensive and trade exposed producers are competing in markets abroad or potentially also domestically, whereby they are in competition with entities that do not pay carbon prices commensurate with what is being paid in Australia, there is a method to actually equalize that price by applying an adjustment at the border, whether it's in import markets or export markets. So those are the essential policy alternatives were Australia to go down the path of having a national carbon price. So, what would be the benefits of having a national carbon price and a national market based measure to deal with climate change in Australia? Well, the first and perhaps most obvious benefit of having a market based measure is that the burden to fund the emission reductions across the Australian economy would be shifted from the state or the public expense onto the private sector. So that would be particularly important, especially in an environment where there are lots of budget pressures and expenditure pressures on Australian governments at both the federal and also at the state level. So that's the first and foremost benefit. And the second benefit, which is really important as well, is that by enhancing market forces to make capital allocation decisions about which emission reduction activities to invest in, it is actually more likely to get an efficient capital allocation across the Australian economy. And therefore, it would be possible to meet more aggressive and more ambitious climate targets at lower cost. So, those are the two principal benefits that exist by having a national carbon price and by including as many possible sectors within the Australian economy in that program. And what would be the costs associated with having a national carbon price? Well, in the first instance, having a national carbon price would mean that there will be some industries that would be better off as a result of having a carbon price, perhaps more competitive, and there will be others that will lose. And so there'll be, in principle, the potential for across the Australian economy to have some degree of wealth transfer. So that's going to be quite politically important, and it's also going to be relevant to some industries that may fare relatively worse under a scenario where there's a national carbon price. Another really important one is that if Australia implements an aggressive or ambitious carbon pricing regime, whereby its industry is now paying a carbon price which is orders of magnitude greater than the import competition products coming into Australia, if they're in locations where there are no carbon prices or perhaps lower carbon prices, it could affect the competitiveness of Australian industry. Likewise, it is also possible that Australian exporters, particularly if you look at aluminium, which is a very emissions intensive and trade exposed export industry, it may be competing in markets that where competitors do not pay these carbon prices and be relatively negatively affected. So these are the two potential downsides. There's also perhaps a third, and that is that in principle, the price of things in the Australian economy, particularly carbon intensive products and services, may actually end up costing more. So, in principle, there could be some degree of price pressure here for Australian consumers. However, there is a possibility that through the design of a national carbon pricing system, any resultant price increases can actually be recycled so that the receipts that the government makes in terms of selling emissions permits under emissions trading or the carbon tax revenue can then be distributed back to Australian citizens and businesses in the form of tax cuts so that the overall impact, the fiscal impact, is reduced down to zero or made as little as possible. So there are some potential solutions to that third issue, but it's worth raising as well as a potential downside or cost associated with having a national carbon price. So, what is the policy platform that Australia currently has? Well, there are a number of initiatives, and Australia is certainly not starting from ground zero when it comes to having a national carbon price. In the first instance, there is a mechanism called the safeguard mechanism, which essentially applies to the largest 200 or 215 emitters across Australia in the industrial sectors and also in mining. And what the safeguard mechanism basically does, first of all, it requires that those companies report their emissions annually to the clean energy regulator and also then to achieve emissions that are below baselines for the production of those processes and within those industries. Now, if entities are able to um, overperform their baseline, then they are allowed to sell the surplus emission reductions, if you like, below those baseline levels. And of course, if companies are unable to achieve their baseline in a given year or in a given group of years, they have the option then to either purchase credits from the entities that have successfully reduced emissions below their baseline, or they can purchase certificates from the Australian carbon credit unit market, which I'll talk about in just a moment, offset credits essentially. The next measure that Australia has, which is independent of the safeguard mechanism for the electricity generation sector, is a renewable energy target program. So Australia incentivises the construction of renewable energy projects by allowing those projects to generate certificates for the megawatt hours they produce, and then obliging energy retailers to purchase certificates that are equivalent to nominal percentages of their annual sales. And this mechanism has been in place for quite a period of time, but it actually expires in 2030. So there is a question about what comes after 2030. The other thing that's really important, as mentioned before, the program's been very successful, and so now there's probably enough projects to satisfy the demand out to 2030. So there's a real question about what demand is going to be there after 2030, and certainly the certificate market has fallen in price. We're going through a fairly bearish period because there is this uncertainty about demand after 2030. The Australian carbon credit unit market, as I mentioned before, is an opportunity for sectors that are outside the safeguard mechanism coverage to produce offset credits and then sell those to entities covered by the safeguard mechanism. And this is quite popular in the farming sector and also with respect to land use and forestry projects. There are also some other sectors that can participate, but essentially the idea is that you can produce a carbon credit by getting a project approved by the clean energy regulator, and after the project is operational, certificates can be issued, and those certificates can then be sold into the safeguard mechanism market. And there's also some voluntary demand for those certificates across Australia. And then Australia also has a couple of public funding bodies, such as the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. There's also the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, or ARENA, among others, that provide public funding for things like research and development, as well as to help finance low emission technologies, in particular a focus on breakthrough technologies and new innovations. So there are several programs that Australia has to deal with climate change overall. Of course, there are more, but those are probably the four main ones. But the point is that a national carbon price would actually introduce a degree of merging of some of those programs and would deal with sectors as a whole. So instead of having a safeguard mechanism for industry and mining, and a renewable energy target for electricity generation, and an ACCU market for land use and farming, the idea would be to integrate all of those sectors together and create a national and uniform carbon pricing system. There are probably some of you watching this video who are finding a deep sense of irony as we discuss national carbon pricing for Australia, saying, hasn't Australia already had a national carbon price before? And the answer to that question, of course, is yes, it has. The Clean Energy Act, which was passed in 2011, introduced an emissions trading system for a period of around 3 years before it was repealed in 2014, where the emissions trading system had a fixed price of $23 a tonne for the first 3 years. And as a result, it became known as a carbon tax program, even though it probably more correctly was described as an emissions trading system that just had a fixed price for the first 3 years of operation. However, the repeal in 2014 did actually occur. It was on the back of a very lengthy process that got to the stage where there was some legislation that could pass in Australia. But along the way, a lot of leaders of opposition parties as well as governments effectively lost their jobs over the issue of climate change and of national carbon pricing. And for example, before Prime Minister Gillard, who successfully passed the legislation of the Clean Energy Act 2011, there were various high profile failures to pass legislation during the period when Kevin Rudd was the Prime Minister and Malcolm Turnbull was the opposition leader. That was called the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. And indeed, since 2014, following the repeal of the Act, there's also been the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015 at the United Nations level, which has increased the global effort to reduce emissions. And so it's been very difficult to avoid the issue of tackling climate change, even despite the repeal of the national carbon price legislation. And so as a result, here we are in 2025, still discussing the same issue. And if anything, the issue has become more pressing, more urgent, and certainly some of the conditions that applied in 2014, where there were concerns that other countries around the world in the region, Australian trading partners, were not moving as quickly as Australia. Some of those assumptions have now been now no longer apply because we see countries, for example, like Japan is considering now emissions trading. South Korea has an emissions trading system. So does China, albeit limited at the moment to some specific sectors, but there are considerations about expanding the China emissions trading system. And there are many other examples across the world. So the world is, in fact, a quite different place now than what it was in 2014. So, hence, having a discussion about a national carbon price is in some ways deja vu based on what we've seen in Australia, but in another respect, it's probably an important and necessary discussion to have as Australia tries to get its head around exactly what is the best way to tackle this problem from a national economic perspective. And so perhaps the final question at this stage is what kind of political reaction are we likely to see from proposals to introduce a national carbon price? Well, the first thing to point out is that it really is at the moment only a discussion that's taking place. It may get discussed at the Treasury Roundtable later on this month in Canberra, the capital city of Australia. Certainly, there's been no indication from any official government source that it specifically intends to promote this policy. So at the moment, it's really a general discussion. The other thing that's really important is we don't know the specific details of how a design in the current context would look, with whether it would be an emissions trading system or whether it would be a carbon tax, whether it would be linked to international markets either directly or indirectly, and whether there would be a carbon border adjustment mechanism included in its design. So there's still a lot to be discussed here. So it's very difficult to say what would be the political reaction or the reaction from industry or general voters at this point in time. What is very interesting, though, is that the coalition, after having suffered a reasonably solid defeat in the 2025 general election held in May, is now currently reviewing its policies with respect to going forward. There's a new leader, Susan Lee, who's organizing that. There's also there have been some quite strong disagreements with the coalition partner, the National Party in Australia, over things like climate policy and the question of net zero. So it's unclear at this stage exactly what the opposition's attitude would be towards a national carbon price. Having said that, since the election, there have been some high profile members of parliament and members of the Senate from the opposition who have voiced strong support for more market based approaches to dealing with things like energy and environmental policy in Australia. But that certainly doesn't represent an overall policy position. And we do know that the opposition is currently in this phase of considering what its policy platform is going to be. So, in the absence of any details about what is being proposed or what could be proposed in Australia, without any indication as to whether or not the government would actually support a reform like a national carbon price, notwithstanding all of the high profile voices that are now starting to discuss such an opportunity, there is simply no basis on which at the moment we can really tell what the political fortunes of this kind of a proposal would be in Australia for now. But what we do know is that the discussion has started, and it's going to be increasingly important as Australia considers those policy options for things like what the renewable energy target will be after 2030, if there's going to be one at all, how Australia will present its emission reductions commitment to the Conference of the Parties in Belém a little bit later on this year. So there's a number of important drivers that are going to accelerate consideration of the future policy mix. And with the high profile economic voices that are calling for a national carbon price, it's going to be an interesting next few months as these issues are discussed. So that brings to a conclusion our consideration of the question of whether Australia should have a national carbon price for today. Clearly, over the next weeks and months, there's going to be a lot more discussion. But what do you think? Please let me know in the comments below. Is a national carbon price a good idea for Australia? If it is a good idea, should it be an emissions trading system, or would it be better to go down the path of a carbon tax? Should the system be linked either directly or indirectly to international markets? And would it be appropriate to have a carbon border adjustment mechanism as well? Or is all of this too much, and actually Australia would be better off to focus on improving the systems it already has in place, like the safeguard mechanism and extending the renewable energy target? Please let me know what you think, and if you've got any other suggestions along the way as well. But for now, I'd like to say thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.